Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today, getting into our running back rankings for week 15 of the fantasy football season. And for most of you, I would hope all of you, if you're playing in a fantasy league where your fantasy championship is in the last week of the season, you were doing it very wrong. Hopefully the first week of your fantasy playoffs. Congrats on getting here. This is a crucial video for our running backs. I'll pretty much get through every single game probably this week. There might be a few players that I missed. I'll have my top 30 guys at the position, and as well some players that I'm leaving out. If you guys enjoyed today's video, if you get some value from it, definitely hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel as well. If you're new, we'll have more for you throughout the week, getting you ready for this first week of the fantasy playoffs. Let's jump into these rankings. First up, by no surprise, Christian McCaffrey coming in at number 1, getting that matchup with Arizona, 31st in fantasy points allowed to the running back position. At 2, Bijan Robinson getting Carolina, another great matchup for him as well, building out that separation from Tyler Algier and his usage in this offense. I think he'll play a huge role in this game for the Falcons, as the Panthers are 30th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 27th in EPA against the run as well. So a great matchup. Kyron Williams comes in as my RB3. Look, since he's returned from injury, he's been maybe, like a top 2-3 back on the season since then. So definitely feel great about him against this Washington team that's taken a huge step back defensively since the trade deadline as well. 25th in fantasy points allowed to the running back position and 26th in EPA against the run. Great matchup, great volume for Williams as the top option in this offense. Just one of the best backs in fantasy right now. 4, Rachaad White. Been a long time since I've had White this high in my rankings, but look, consistent opportunity. I think Baker Mayfield and the passing offense have not looked good whatsoever, so you should expect to see White get a significant amount of volume here against the Packers team that has very much struggled against the run. We saw it in their loss this past week to the Giants as well. The Packers on the season 26th in fantasy points allowed to the running back position, so a good spot here with them also being 22nd, in EPA against the run as well. 5, Alvin Kamara. Derek Carr continues to play despite injury after injury after injury. Last week wasn't great, but I think here matchup with the Giants, a team that likes to blitz quite a bit as well. You should see Kamara collecting a lot of dump-off passes here from Carr. On the season 2, Giants 27th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 25th in EPA per opponent rush attempt. So good matchup here. Rounding out our top 6 backs, Zach Moss. Colts getting Pittsburgh this week. Pittsburgh has very much improved in their pass defense with getting Minkah Fitzpatrick on the field a little bit more, but the run defense is still a problem. Was a problem last week as well against the Patriots, with Zeke kind of being able to close things out in this game to be able to bring the Patriots that win and run the ball not super efficiently, but they're just able to move the chains quite a bit with him. I think the same goes here for Moss, off a bad week as well against the Bengals, but I think he bounces back. The Steelers 23rd in fantasy points allowed to running backs this season. We're closing out our top 12 here, moving to the next 6 backs. Austin Eckler. Now that we're going to be missing Justin Herbert for the remainder of the season, you're going to have Easton Stick at quarterback. You're going to want to run the football, or you're going to see this team run the football more, and we saw Eckler look a lot better, and obviously a big blowout game here, but a game where he got much more receiving work, which he has not gotten the last 6-7 weeks now. That is good sign for him, and feel good about the matchup too. That has me confident and feeling very comfortable with playing him, because the Raiders 24th in fantasy points allowed to running backs, 21st in EPA against the run as well. 8, Dave Montgomery. The Lions backs are going to feast this week. I feel great about both of them. I have both of these guys in my top 12. Surprise. But Denver, perfect matchup. Dead last in fantasy points allowed, 30th in EPA, 21st in run defense grade from PFF. They're giving up the highest yards per carry in the entire league this season. Dave Montgomery will score a touchdown, no doubt about it this week. I'm very confident. These 2 backs I would be targeting very heavily if you're betting. The Lions are going to be my favorite play of the entire week for any of you guys that watch our betting picks that have been doing really well this season. But love the Lions matchup here offensively. I think they can score a lot of points, and I think the backs will be the biggest beneficiary in that. 9, Raheem Mostert. Von Achane was pretty efficient with his opportunities yesterday against the Titans, but Mostert had much more significant share. Achane getting more of the receiving work. I think Mostert can really benefit here when you look at this Jets team. That yes, Zach Wilson is back. Can we continue to get the offensive performance we got this past week heading into this week? I don't really expect to see that. The Dolphins are a very good defense, but the Jets though giving up 22nd in fantasy points allowed to running backs this season. So it has not necessarily been a strength for them. It's because the pass defense has been so good, and we saw the backs have success against the Jets just a few weeks ago. 10, Saquon Barkley. Barkley getting New Orleans starting to fall back a little bit. They were in a really one of the elite run defenses early in the year, but now they're outside the top 10 in all my major categories that I'm looking at. 13th in fantasy points allowed, 19th in EPA. As long as Tommy DeVito's at QB, the run game is where things are going to move here. We saw the Giants throw the ball only 20 times this past week. Barkley's going to be the straw that stirs the drink for this offense, and I don't think he'll be in too much trouble here against this Saints defense. 11, Tony Pollard. I'm a little bit concerned about Rico Dowdle's usage. I mentioned it in our waiver wire video, and especially so seeing Dowdle getting the touchdown and getting the inside the 5 work while Pollard was on the sidelines. But Pollard saved this was weak in the receiving game. I would expect that to continue to be the case here against this Bills team. Going to be a competitive game as well, I would expect. The Bills are favorites in this game too. So I think that Pollard's still going to be a good start for you, but just ceiling seems lowered here, which gives me a little bit of concern. Then around here in our top 12, Jahmyr Gibbs talked about it when it comes to this Lions matchup and how good it's going to be offensively for them against this Broncos defense. I think Gibbs is the number 2 here in this offense. He had one more carry than Montgomery did, but again, the Lions were trailing in this game, so you usually see Gibbs on the field a little bit more because of that. Did see Gibbs find the end zone too, which was really helpful, but I do think Montgomery's the guy they want to go to convert goal line opportunities and in the red area. So give him the slight edge, but still feel great about Gibbs as well. All right, moving into RB2s on the week. This is where I struggled because there's a lot of running backs with matchups that I don't necessarily love, but Derrick Henry gets Houston. He's the RB13 for me on the week. Houston's middle of the road defensively, but they moved up in some categories. They're just outside the top 10 in EPA against the run, but they're 27th in PFF's run defense grade, and then right in the middle of the league when it comes to fantasy points allowed to running backs. If they are missing CJ Stroud, which I do think there's probably a good likelihood they will, because I know they really need him to get themselves in the postseason, but this is a game they could win with Davis Mills at QB. I do think that. But if they don't have Stroud, that's going to make this game really beneficial for the Titans in terms of being able to keep things close, potentially leading, potentially holding a lead and protecting it by giving the ball to Henry. I don't think the Texans have reached a spot here where I necessarily fear their run defense. It's just going to be about game script, and there's a decent chance Henry has the game script to be able to do so. So he's my RB13 with the expectation that Stroud doesn't play this week. If Stroud does, Henry would be more in my RB18 area. I'd still be starting him this week. 14, James Cook, coming off a huge week after I had him as a guy that I was really scared of starting. He was outside my top 24. I think he was right in the precipice of RB30 this week. Proved me wrong. Had a huge week against the Chiefs. Receiving game, rushing game. I'm going to feel confident going to him here against Dallas. Another game that should be competitive, similar to that of the game against Kansas City. Now, Dallas is a very good run defense, better than Kansas City's, 4th in fantasy points allowed, 6th in EPA. But Cook has proven to be an efficient back all season long, and I think he'll get on the field even more so now after the big game. So feel confident in him and what he can do, to be able to give you a great floor with his receiving work. That's why I have him as a pretty settled RB2 on the week. 15, Travis Etienne. Trevor Lawrence dealing with the injury, right? We're getting, and Etienne's also a little bit banged up as well, if you remember from just a couple of weeks ago. Baltimore's a tough matchup, 5th in fantasy points allowed to running backs this season. They've been a really good group. Etienne's usage, volume, and opportunities should kind of carry weight for me here in my ranking and creep him into the upper half of my RB2s. And then also just when you look at Trevor Lawrence being a little banged up as well, we could see Etienne being even more important in that aspect too. 16, Devon Achane. I mentioned Raheem Mostert having the edge here in this backfield in terms of touches and opportunities. Achane's still going to contribute, still be a great play because, again, he's one of the most explosive backs in the league. He has the highest yards per carry in the league. I think he still had about 6 yards per carry this past week as well against the Titans of a solid run defense. The Jets, good defense, but not quite as good against the run, so could lead to some more volume for these guys too. 17, Breece Hall continues to put up monster numbers in the receiving game. He had 9 targets this past week and 8 receptions, finding the end zone again, but just doing nothing on the ground. Hasn't done anything on the ground all season. Miami's a tough matchup, 14th in fantasy points allowed to the running back position, just above the upper half of the league. And for Hall, I feel like, with how poor the running game is behind this offensive line, it's hard to put him as a top 12 guy in a matchup that isn't it's got to be a plus matchup for me to want to have him on the precipice of a top 12 guy, but still feel confident with his touches, with the teams just focused on finding creative ways to get him the ball because they know how talented he is. 18, DeAndre Swift, getting that Seattle defense. Seattle's really fallen off here. They're now 28th in fantasy points allowed, 24th in EPA against the run. So this is a game for DeAndre Swift to be able to run the ball effectively. The Eagles are on the road here, and they are not a very large favorite. I think it's 3.5, 4 points. So it's a game that could be competitive, but does give the edge to Seattle. I think Swift is going to get a good amount of touches in this game and be a little bit more efficient than he's been the last couple of weeks. Coming off the tough matchup with Dallas, we get a much softer one here. I feel pretty confident him being able to turn that into some production in this one. 19, Joe Mixon. So with Mixon, obviously we're seeing Chase Brown and his role grow. We've seen it the last 2 weeks now, and that gives me some pause. But Mixon's been able to produce in the receiving game, be a decently efficient runner, and make the most of his opportunities. This is a matchup with Minnesota that makes things a little bit tougher because Minnesota on the season is 3rd in fantasy points allowed to running backs and 8th in EPA against the run. So it's not a great matchup for their running game. We could see Mixon run a fair bit less efficiently, but there is the likelihood that we see Mixon continue to get his targets and get those receptions up, help you in half PPR, full PPR format. So I still feel comfortable playing him. I just think the ceiling is capped a little bit here with this Vikings matchup because with Brian Flores coaching the defense, all of his defenses, New England, Miami, and now Minnesota have been great against the run. So I'm just going to believe that because it's such a long period of time that he's sustained that. 20, Najee Harris. Harris gets a good matchup with the Colts. He kind of took over and Warren was pretty much found himself on the sidelines for the majority of this past week's Thursday nighter against the Patriots, and Harris getting the bulk of opportunities. Indy provides some positive, great opportunity. They get Grover Stewart back on the D-line, which is a big time help for their run defense, but didn't help them too much against the Bengals this past week. 29th in fantasy points allowed to running backs are the Colts, 20th in EPA as well. So it's a good matchup here that we could see Harris take advantage of. 21, Chuba Hubbard. Mentioned that he was a guy that you definitely should be starting because of the volume, because of the opportunities, and he put together a pretty decent week. Got into double-digit fantasy points, proved to be basically what I expect him to be, which was like a RB3. And I think you can continue to trust that because, look, Carolina's passing offense has been lethargic. It's been terrible. They got a matchup here with Atlanta, a game that I think could be relatively tight. Carolina's at home here. They're a very short underdog. If it is relatively close, Hubbard will get volume because even in a game that Panthers were never in, Hubbard still had over 20 touches. I would expect that to continue to be the case. Atlanta's a tough team to run the ball on, but so are a lot of the teams we've seen Hubbard be able to run the ball effectively against. The Bucks last week against the Saints as well. I think Atlanta's no different, but they are a very good defense. They're rated number one in run defense grade from PFF, so not super high on him, but definitely think he's going to give you a good floor with his touches. 22, Jerome Ford. Ford gets the Chicago defense. I've always said to you guys that Chicago does boast a good run defense. They are third in EPA against the run this season, but they are 21st in fantasy points allowed to running backs. This is a game where the Browns find themselves as favorites. Ford's been efficient in some games that I've kind of looked at as one that would be pretty tough. Ford gave us a good enough performance, I guess I would say, in the matchup with Jacksonville last week. Here's a chance for another positive game script. I think he's playable for you. Not super high on him, but definitely playable. AJ Dillon comes in as my RB23. I would expect that Aaron Jones doesn't play this week, but it's hard to say. This is my ranking on Dillon with Jones out. If Jones is in, neither one of these guys are going to be great starts for you. They'll probably be on my must sit, to be honest, because again, splitting these touches and then getting Tampa's defense, who's top 10 in EPA, top 10 in fantasy points allowed, it's just one that's a fair bit more difficult. And I think they'll get Vita Vea back. They could get Evan White back. That'll help that run defense even further. And just again, playing this Bucks team, you do want to put the ball in the air, and that doesn't necessarily help Dillon at all, who's much less of a pass catcher to Jones and should just really be on the field in a lot of like short distance situations, obvious running downs. 24, rounding out our RB2s on the week. Kenneth Walker. Zach Charbonnet had more carries than Walker did, but it was only by about one. And then Walker had more work in the receiving game. Philadelphia, not necessarily a great matchup, but they're still the number one defense in fantasy points allowed, but they are actually dead last in EP against the run. Their run defense has not been as good as it was early in the season. It hasn't reflected in the fantasy points quite yet. Still think they're a great run defense. No longer really think of them as the best in the league. But for Walker, the reason I have him as a guy you could still play is I do think he's capable of generating explosive plays. He's going to be the guy they go to convert touchdowns. And we've seen this Philly defense really struggle against the pass. So if they get into those scoring areas, Walker will be the guy to convert them. And that kind of makes him a player that could potentially have a high ceiling for you, which you need in your first week of the playoffs as well. All right, looking at flex options. Guys just inside my top 30. We're starting with James Conner. Gets the difficult matchup against San Francisco. That can't be understated. Second in fantasy points allowed. Sixth in run defense grade from PFF as well. Connor's proven to be able to find ways to generate fantasy production regardless of matchup. If it's a tough rushing matchup, he'll find ways to produce in the receiving game. I know we get Kyler Murray. That's why I've bumped Connor a fair bit lower than where I usually do in the tough matchups, because Murray can, potentially steal touchdowns, potentially steal some rushing work, and doesn't check down quite as much as a Josh Dobbs would. Still feel like he's playable though, because again, this was a Cardinals team that competed with San Francisco early in the season without Murray. I think they can still do that here with Murray too. 26, Javonte Williams. He's one of the guys I think I'm lowest on this week. I think this is a huge game for Detroit. I think they find a ton of success offensively. I think Williams' role, which is being the early downs back, ends up being phased out of this game. And Detroit's a team that's really good against the run. 8th in fantasy points allowed, 9th in EPA, 4th in run defense grade. This team stops the run, is one of the most efficient run defenses in the league, but has struggled mightily against the pass. I think that's where we're going to see the Broncos look to be utilizing Russell Wilson and the passing offense more. 27, Zamir White. You notice that I never mentioned Josh Jacobs. I'd be shocked if he plays this week with a short turnaround. I think White will be the top dog in this offense, but you're still going to see Amir Abdullah, and that's why White's a player I think you can play in your flex, but I'm not saying you're going to get Josh Jacobs production from Zamir White. That's saying that I mean you're not going to get quite the volume. You could get better efficiency because Jacobs hasn't been super efficient, but again, running behind this offensive line is probably more the problem than it is the problem that Jacobs is as a runner. But the Chargers aren't a bad matchup, 20th in fantasy points allowed, so you could find Zamir White be a player that you add off the wire and gives you what you need this week. It's just it's a risky play. That's why I have him just barely inside my top 30. 28, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Not a good matchup for the Chiefs running game, I will say. Could lead to more of a passing volume. They're the number one defense in EP against the runner. The Patriots, 9th in fantasy points allowed this season as well. But I do think this is a game where the Chiefs can build a positive game script, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire will be the guy they want to feed the ball to in the traditional running game, clock killing opportunities, and more of those scoring opportunities I think will go to Helaire. Unlike for McKinnon last week, the Chiefs were trailing the majority of that game, so McKinnon was the one on the field more. I think that flips in this game, and that lends itself to Clyde being the player I would prefer prefer to play. 29, Gus Edwards. The Jags are still a good run defense, still a top 10 defensive fantasy points allowed to running backs. They're falling more into the middle of the pack in some of these advanced metrics against the run. Still think they're a good run defense. Edwards is a player that's just relying on scoring touchdowns and touchdown opportunities. I don't think the Jags defense is one to be scared of, so I do think the Ravens will have scoring opportunities and Gus can convert those. But again, his role is just so limited that he's just such a low floor like we saw this past week, but there can be that ceiling of finding the end zone twice, and he could really kind of win you a week. So it's got to be calculated. You got to look at your team and feel where you're at in terms of, hey, am I a big underdog in this matchup? Hey, do I feel like if everybody plays to what they should in a decent, if everyone plays to expectation or gives me their average, am I going to handle business here and have my opponent well outweighed? If I do, then Gus Edwards is a guy I probably sit because I don't want to experience that floor. But if I'm an underdog, Edwards is a player that could give you that high ceiling. 30, Ty Chandler, rounding out our top 30 backs on the week. I don't think we'll see Alexander Mattison with the ankle sprain. Maybe we do. If we do, then probably neither one of these guys are going to feel great to start. I would say neither one of these guys feel great to start because I don't think Mattison will be 100%. But Chandler by himself could be valuable to you if you had him off the wire. The Bengals, 19th in fantasy points allowed this season, second to last in EPA against the run. They have not been a good run defense this season, despite a good performance against the Colts last week. If Chandler has the backfield to himself, I think he could provide some value for you, especially with what the Niners or the Vikings will be rolling out at quarterback. Likely going to see Nick Mullins. So I think that could benefit Chandler as well because he's capable of being a full 3-down back too. That's the thing that I don't want you to overlook is that he's not just going to get there in the running game. He will play as a receiver as well, which he did a great job of in college, and I think can translate here in this matchup too. All right, now some of the players that I have outside of my top 30 that I just want to briefly mention to you. The situation with Houston, with the potential of missing CJ Stroud, the Titans are a team that I do think are pretty solid against the run. Singletary, I think, is now the top option in this offense. He had way more touches than Dameon Pierce did, and Pierce with his opportunities was just terrible. And Singletary was just good. He found the end zone as well. He's a guy that kind of burned me that I didn't play, but put together a good week. So he's my RB31. Could see you starting him. I just think this is a team that might struggle to score points if they are missing him. And again, it's still like every week that you say that Singletary is the top guy, Pierce somehow manages to be the one they want to go to a little bit more often. Keaton Mitchell, another risky play. He's not going to get the touchdown opportunities. You're looking for him to generate explosive plays. Can he do that against Jacksonville's defense? What he could do is contribute a good amount in the receiving game. That's what we've seen a lot of running backs do against Jacksonville. They're giving up the most receptions to running backs this season. So that's something to keep in mind for Mitchell as a bit of a risky play. I don't know if Brian Robinson's going to play this week. The Commanders have said absolutely nothing. So that's something we want to discuss a little bit more on the Sunday morning Twitch stream to see where things materialize throughout the week as to what to do with this Washington Commanders backfield. If they're missing Robinson, it's just Antonio Gibson. That is a little bit intriguing. Jalen Warren with his role kind of being a little bit more limited, RB34 in the week. And then guys like Zach Charbonnet and Jerick McKinnon round out into like that RB35, 36 territory. If there's players I've missed, which I know I didn't talk about the Chicago Bears, feel free to drop those players down below in the comments. Happy to answer them. If you've got questions between a running back or wide receiver putting in your flex this week, throw those questions down below as well. Happy to answer them, give you an idea of what I think you should be doing heading into the first week of the fantasy football playoffs. Guys, thank you so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed today's video, hit that like button for me, and we will see you on the next one.